She arrived in town chasing a new beginning, only to be rejected on sight by the man who had promised her love. Henry Selmers, blinded by appearances, couldn't see the heart behind the face he dismissed so quickly. But fate had other plans, and a silent man with a steady gaze saw what no one else did. Just wait until you see how this quiet storm turned, and why, in the end, justice had the final word. When the train hissed to a halt at the edge of Linden Falls, the station remained still, almost uninterested in the lone woman who stepped onto the platform. A thin mist clung to the edges of the tracks, curling around the iron wheels like forgotten promises. No one rushed to greet her, no warm embraces, no flowers in hand, just the faint whistle of wind and the echo of a world she had left behind. Emily Harper stood in her simple gray dress, the hem slightly frayed from the long journey. Her suitcase, an old square thing bound in twine, rested at her side like a faithful dog. She clutched its handle with both hands, her knuckles pale, not from cold, but from the weight of hope. This was it, her final chance. She had left her modest boarding room in Illinois, the dusty town library where she shelved books, and the kind-eyed landlady who hugged her too tight on departure. All of it traded for one man, one name, one set of promises sealed in ink, Mr. Henry Selmers, a widower with 2 sons. A man who claimed he wanted not just a companion, but a partner with a tender heart. They had exchanged letters for almost a year. He said her words moved him. He said he admired her honesty. Now she stood at the threshold of his world. He was waiting by the ticket counter, a small fedora tipped forward, gray in the beard, his posture as neat as his penmanship. For a split second, Emily saw something like recognition spark in his eyes. And then, something else. Discomfort. Then came the shift. A visible flicker of judgment. He scanned her face, and the warmth in his gaze turned brittle. "You," he stammered, "you don't look like your portrait." Emily felt the air stretch between them, thin and sharp like fishing line. "I'm sorry, I can't," he said, stepping back as though avoiding a blow. I expected." His words crumbled in his throat, and then he turned. Not another word, not an apology that mattered, just the sound of his polished boots retreating across the platform and into the crowd. Emily stood frozen. Her shoulders tightened. Her lips, uneven from the scar that had traced them since birth, pressed together. She had always known her face was different. Strong jaw, thick brows, the repaired cleft that never quite vanished despite years of correction. But she had hoped, just this once, that the heart behind her letters would be enough. The townsfolk began to murmur, some curious, others indifferent. A few teenage boys chuckled behind cupped hands. One older woman whispered something sharp and brief before walking off. No one stepped closer. No one asked if she was all right. She stood alone, not just in place, but in presence, like a statue carved from a different stone. Except one. In the shadow near the freight crate stood a man, towering, broad-shouldered, dressed in a shirt that had clearly seen better seasons. A wood-handled axe hung from the sling across his back. His boots were scuffed, his face unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he looked. And he did not look away. 2 nights. That's how long Emily Harper lived on the wooden bench outside McAllister's general store. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't leave. Pride held her spine upright, even when her stomach turned hollow and the spring wind bit through her sleeves. Her suitcase sat beneath her knees, the twine still tight around its seams, and her coat, though thin, was buttoned to the collar like a uniform against surrender. The townsfolk passed her by. Some offered glances, most offered nothing. She'd once worked in a quiet library in Illinois, surrounded by the whisper of pages and the scent of aging ink. She had read Melville by oil lamp and Bronte during lunch breaks. Her mind was sharp, her heart hopeful. But here, she was only the woman who'd been rejected on the platform. By the 3rd morning, the drizzle had turned into a full storm. Rain pelted the storefront awning above her like 1,000 impatient fingers. Her skirt clung to her knees. Her shoes had given up the fight long ago. And then she saw him. He stood not 10 feet away, rain curling down the sleeves of his faded flannel. The man from the station. The one with the mountain in his shoulders and something solemn in his face. The axe was gone, but the presence remained. Heavy. Real. "I'm Jude," he said, voice like gravel, softened by rain. He didn't explain how he found her, didn't ask why she was still here. "I've got a cabin, up in the ridge," he added. "Old stove, roof holds, you can stay." Emily blinked. Her breath hitched, just once, more from disbelief than fear. She searched his expression, expecting pity, but there was none. No awkward tilt of the head, no rehearsed charity, just a man offering shelter the way one might offer their last match in the dark. "Emily," she replied softly, almost to herself, then louder, "Thank you." She rose. Her legs wobbled, but she stood straight. The walk to the cabin took nearly an hour, mostly uphill, mostly quiet. Jude didn't speak, and she didn't force it. The woods around them smelled of pine and wet earth. By the time they reached the clearing, her hands were trembling from the cold, but her chest, somehow, felt steadier. The cabin was small, built of weathered logs and patience. Inside, a stove, a narrow bed, shelves made of crate boards, a tin kettle, firewood stacked like puzzle pieces, and silence. Jude showed her the chair by the hearth and wordlessly stirred the coals back to life. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He simply moved as if he'd always expected her to be there. Later, after she'd dried off and warmed her fingers by the fire, Jude returned from a side room with a woolen blanket, old, but clean, and a thick paperback book. He laid both on the table beside her, the blanket first, then the book, The Woman in White. "You read?" she asked, her voice touched with surprise. Jude gave a slow nod. "Quiet voices," he said, eyes steady, "tend to say the loudest things." Emily looked down at the cover. Her lips trembled, not from cold, and in that small room, with the fire crackling low and the storm pushing against the walls, she felt something she hadn't in days. Not safety, but possibility. Days passed quietly in the cabin, marked not by clocks, but by the rhythm of shared silence and slow trust. Emily had begun to move through the space as if it had always known her, wiping down the wooden counters, shaking dust from old rugs, tidying corners with a soft diligence that spoke not of obligation, but quiet gratitude. In the evenings, she'd read aloud by the hearth. She'd sit curled in the same armchair, knees tucked beneath her, her voice low and steady as the fire beside her. Dickens, Wilkie Collins, sometimes even poetry. Jude would sit across from her, hands clasped loosely, eyes on the flames, or on her, though she rarely looked up to see. He didn't speak much, but when she reached certain passages, ones where a character ached for belonging, or spoke words wrapped in raw honesty, his eyelids would flicker just slightly. A breath caught, a knuckle tightened, that was all, but it was enough to know he heard her. One afternoon, Emily accompanied Jude into town, helping stock flour bags at the general store. Mr. McAllister had begun to greet her with a nod, no longer pretending not to see her. She had become, if not accepted, then at least acknowledged, but not by everyone. As she weighed a sack of flour behind the counter, she heard it, sharp, staged to sound like a whisper, but meant to wound. "Well, well, the plain-faced girl from the train has taken root here, has she?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Lawson, the mayor's wife, thin-lipped and silk-gloved, as if the town were her parlor and its people her guests. Emily didn't look up. She didn't flinch. She simply kept folding the top of the sack. But Jude was near. He stepped forward, not rushed, not loud, but his presence shifted the air. "There's nothing wrong with this town," he said evenly, "except maybe a tongue that doesn't know the weight of its own words." The room went still. Even the flour dust seemed to hang in midair. Mrs. Lawson blinked. She opened her mouth, then closed it. And then she turned, muttering something only the wind could hear, and walked out. Word traveled. It always did. But this time it changed shape. The next morning someone left a warm loaf on the cabin porch, wrapped in linen. A week later a young boy brought her a scarf his grandmother had knitted. Quiet gestures, small reparations, and Emily accepted them not as apologies, but as beginnings. One evening, after helping Jude stack wood near the tree line, Emily stood beside him, brushing sawdust from her sleeves. The sun dipped low, turning the leaves bronze and the silence soft. I don't understand, she said. Her voice was barely above the hush of the woods. Why you've done all this for me. Jude didn't look at her right away. He kept his gaze on the trees, where a deer trail curved into the distance. Because, he said finally, when everyone else turned away, you didn't. He turned toward her then, the light catching the scar on his cheek like a faint echo of the past. And that, he added, is more beautiful than any face I've ever seen. Emily didn't speak. She didn't need to. But for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not because someone saw her, but because someone truly looked. By spring, the cabin had changed, not in structure, but in spirit. Where once there was only earth, now there was a garden. Jude had built her a small greenhouse by hand, with reclaimed glass panels and cedar beams that smelled sweet when the sun warmed them. Together, they grew tomatoes that turned gold on the vine, onions that pressed gently through the soil, and strawberries so red they seemed unreal against the green. Emily spent her mornings there, hands deep in the dirt, sleeves rolled, a faint smile always close to the surface. She no longer counted the days. She no longer looked over her shoulder. The town had softened toward her. Heads nodded when she passed. Children waved. But Emily didn't rely on their eyes anymore. She had found her own reflection, and it was finally enough. That afternoon, the breeze carried the scent of time and the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. She turned toward the porch just as a shadow fell across the threshold. It was Henry Selmers. Older now, shoulders lower, the brim of his hat curled with use. Two boys stood behind him, restless, glancing at the fields with bored curiosity. Emily, he began, hesitating, I made a mistake back then. His eyes flicked from her hands, dirt-stained and steady, to her face, sun-kissed, lined with quiet confidence. You've become a beautiful woman. Emily didn't flinch, didn't bristle. She smiled, just a little. I always was, she said softly. You were just looking the wrong way. And then she closed the door, not harshly, not with bitterness, just with certainty. Behind it stood Jude, holding 2 mugs of tea that steamed like promises. He raised one in silent offering. All right? He asked. Emily took the cup, her fingers brushing his. Her eyes were calm, sure. Now, she said. Yes. He extended his hand without words, and she placed hers into it without hesitation. No shame, no apology, just truth. For the first time, she didn't feel like someone waiting to be accepted. She felt chosen, not by him, not by the town, by herself. And in the quiet warmth of that evening, with the garden behind them and the future ahead, that was the most beautiful thing of all.